Thank you, thank you. Okay, we're now on to the more interactive part. We have an exciting lineup of change makers, leaders, here in the United States and from abroad, from Africa. And so I'm going to call you up one by one and we can all join and have a conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Jacqueline Patiguana. She is actually a YALI Fellow, and she's here as part of her extended YALI experience. So I think you can come up that way. Second, Ms. Sylvie Bello. Is Sylvie here? I can't see her. Ms. Sylvie Bello is the president of the Cameroonian American Council. Also, Mr. Mamadou Samba, who is our executive director of the mayor's office. We may have lost him in the time. And Mr. Patrick Freeman, senior program officer for IREX. Okay, so what we're going to do is our lineup. With today's conversation, we're going to really look at how do you harness opportunities for young African leaders on the continent and through the diaspora. So I'm going to tell you that this is all I think about. So what I recommend is we have a nice conversation, and you all are going to listen to it. And then we're going to open it up, okay? So I'm going to sit here. I'm going to join you guys, okay? All right, before we get into the question on how you harness young African leaders, why don't each of you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about what you do, and then the audience, you can also learn more about the work and the organizational focus that they have. Okay.
I'll go first. My name is Jacqueline Patiguana. I am from Mozambique, and I'm a Mandela Washington Fellow alum. I just finished the fellowship August 1st. And I'm still here in DC doing a professional development experience, which is a second optional selective program that you can do for 6 additional weeks here in the US. I am based at an organization here in DC, Competitive Carriers Association, and they represent about 100 wireless carriers from the US, and they lobby and try to educate policymakers here in DC about policies that create competition, ensure that they thrive, and ensure that there is competitive business, I guess, throughout the U.S. In Mozambique, I actually work for the Ministry of Transport and Communications, so telecommunications is my area of focus. Prior to coming here, I was deputy coordinator for a e-government and communications infrastructure project between my government and the World Bank. And that project just ended, so when I go back, I will likely be on other projects, as well as continuing to advise the Minister of Transport and Communication.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Freeman, and I work with IREX here in Washington, D.C. Day to day, I manage the civic leadership component of the YALI fellowship, and so most of my work spent sort of behind the scenes working with domestic partners to host the fellows, like Jacqueline when they're in the US. Originally from Ghana, and prior to embarking on this particular aspect of my career, I used to work on democracy and governance programs in mostly West Africa. So for me, this program and what the YALI encapsulates is something that's very profound, something which I think helped make me sort of transition to this particular area, because I think it is something that is critical, and to invest in young Africans, to have young Africans doing it, and to sort of begin to impact and to create a shift in how people perceive themselves in terms of being change agents and being able to impact the environment they live in is something which is very important to me, and something which I think will have potentially really long-lasting ramifications for the continent.
Yeah, so we've somehow turned this event into a YALI event and looking at YALI as our US side, but I think it's important to also ask the question more broadly. I mean, I'm a big supporter of YALI, and I've actually learned a lot from the fellows, but I think there's actually a lot of learning to do around youth engagement in the African context. So I want to start the conversation by addressing that question, right? Outside of the YALI as an example, why is it so important to focus on African youth? Because I think in many of our cultures, my family's from Eritrea, and I'm born and raised in the States, but culturally, we pay a lot of respect and deference to our elders. But the world is beginning to change, where young people are being recognized as change agents, probably faster than many countries and cultures are used to. So I guess the first question is, why is it important to focus on harnessing African youth leadership?
I think we have to begin to change the discourse. And you look across many African countries, and the post-colonial experience is often one which is not really, does not sort of represent the aspirations and the outcomes that most people who live in those countries desire. And I think one of the things which I've seen traveling through work across Ghana, in other parts of West Africa, East Africa, and things like that, is beginning to see this change where you do see young people who now, perhaps whereas in the past they might have just wanted a job with the civil service or something right out of school, they sort of begin to find ways to charter their own courses and to find ways to use new technologies to build their own careers. And I think that is really, really critical because, I mean, we've talked about how a significant majority of the current population are youthful in nature, and it's great to see in some regards how these young people are beginning to sort of look beyond the precepts which governed perhaps what their parents might have looked at in terms of careers and outcomes for their lives, for their careers and for their communities. Beyond that, I think if you talk about sustainable development in Africa, you have to talk about, you can't take youth out of the equation. You have to see young Africans doing it for themselves. That's when you begin to see that seismic shift, where you begin to see people who grow up in your communities, who begin to impact those communities, who begin to invent things, come up with new concepts, new ideas that begin to radiate and begin to address some of the issues which face people. I think that is fundamental for any efforts to really to encourage proper change, sustainable change, not superficial, not things which are short-term, but things which really are sustainable over the foreseeable future. And I think that's why it's important to focus on the youth. Beyond that, of course, there are many barriers, structural, environmental, that will continue to impact young people. But I think, just based on my experience, not just with the ALI program, but in interacting with young people across the continent, that there is beginning to be a different way of looking at how you can sort of obtain success, and I think that's important.
I would agree with Patrick, and I would go back to what Dr. Cole and Christopher said before. If 60 to 70% of your population demographics on the continent are below 30 years old, then you really have to start thinking about putting these people in positions where they can give continuity to the work that you've started. So currently we have governments that in some countries have been there more than a decade, etc. Leaders of countries that have been there for too long. You have to think about who are you going to pass the baton to next, and you have to start preparing them and train them. But I also think that focusing on youth gives you innovative solutions to the problems that perhaps you've been trying to fix in ways that have maybe not been successful. So giving an opportunity for a new voice to be heard, you'll come up with solutions that may have not been imaginable from before. We are very connected people now. I think my generation and the ones below even more so than me. So in this connectivity and in this, in the environment in which we grew up, where borders weren't as important perhaps as they were before, we're able to relate to somebody living on the other side of the continent and come up with ideas and observe the way that they manage a problem that is perhaps way different than how you've been doing it for the last couple of decades. So I think it's demographics, but it's also the innovative spark that comes with it.
So then the next question is, in the spirit of Ron Brown's series and in the spirit of this conversation, how do you incorporate the diaspora into that project and into that approach, and how should the diaspora's perspectives be incorporated? I think often about the fact that Africa's future is dependent on its people, and we recognize young people who have all of these skills and ideas, but the other truth is that the movement of African people outside of Africa is also a huge factor. Historically, we have multi-generational African diaspora communities, but then we have a huge uptick right now in African migration in the last 20 years. We've seen communities burgeon and blend, integrate and blend in Europe and in the United States. And the conversation begins for us from where we sit. What do we do in the diaspora to harness that same goal or the same skills, but also put ourselves in it?
Well, I would start by saying, and not to go back to this program, because we're having an open discussion, but I think initiatives such as this one by the U.S. government are a good way to get things back in perspective and get diaspora communicating with the continent. You know, when we came here, I think there were some of us that thought we're coming to the U.S. to basically learn everything and learn the ways in which the American government or the Americans have conducted business. Greatest big economy, democracy is somewhat evident here and visible, something that a lot of countries, I guess, emulate to be. But I think in our coming here, we start to have dialogues and discussions that are two-way streets. So we share a little bit about what we're doing there that might be different and that could be incorporated in how people conduct business here. And in specific with, I think, the diaspora community, you start to form allegiances and see that perhaps the problems that we're facing, and if you think about Black Lives Matter and other problems that are current here in the US, are also similar to what we're going through there. So we trade ideas in this way. It's not a one-way street. It's an exchange and of ideas. And so I really do believe that the Mandela Washington Fellowship and other programs that are coming up and are being created are one way to keep that flow of information two-way.
I'm going to put it out there that I think Mandela Fellows Program should have a few slots for diaspora entrepreneurs. I'm just putting that out there to you, to some people in the audience, which we talk about often. But Patrick, what are your thoughts from the IREX perspective around diaspora in youth leadership?
And not just from the IREX perspective, but from my personal opinions, I think it's a really, really critical area that needs to be strengthened. I think there are a lot of parallels in the experience of people in the diaspora in America, in the UK, in the Caribbean, and with those back on the continent. And I think that sadly, you often don't find the opportunities for people to engage, for those conversations to happen and to find those points of convergence. And also, frankly, points of inspiration. When you talk to people, it does sort of illuminate people's outlook on how they perceive their own problems, juxtaposed to other people's. And I think there's also additionally, there's obviously a lot of knowledge, skills that can be exchanged both ways. And it's sort of trying to find really palpable, concrete ways to make sure that is not something that's a flash in the pan kind of thing, but something that's really concrete and effective and sustainable. And I think it's good. It's a good point you made, because it's something which I've actually been ruminating on a lot, and I think we're going to be taking steps to sort of find ways to increase that kind of engagement. I think it's very, very important for these conversations to be had. Ultimately, everything starts at the individual level, and once you begin to encourage people to interact, to talk, and then things can happen organically, and then who knows where those outcomes will go.
Okay, so just looking at our time, because we had a late start, I want to turn it over to the audience now, and have a bit of time for questions. And we just want to be mindful of the program and the schedule and everyone's time. So perhaps we can turn it over and we can ask some questions. Again, because of time constraints, let's try to keep the questions as concise as possible. Welcome to, and if you could just introduce yourselves, okay? Friend over there.
My name is Ilani Abin, and I'm from Cameroon. I've been in the oil and gas industry and been working on a consulting company across Africa, now based in Rwanda and Angola. I want my question to be framed in a cultural framework. I've had a chance to receive a lot of Yali fellows. Timmy, the law, came and visited me at my office. And I had a question to him, and I want to ask the panel. For leadership to be sustainable, if you just take it away from all the other economic aspects, it has to be built from cultures. When you have programs like this, I want to know how Yali addresses this. You bring, African young ones from different countries to the US. How do you maintain that critical aspect of sustainable leadership, that is culture? If we look at developments in areas that were like Africa in the 1980s, like China, Vietnam, Singapore, those countries are sustainable in their development because their leaders grew up with the values of their people. And I'm not trying to be controversial, though. I want to know how Yali maintains that iota, that key thing, because Africa is a nation that people feel started in 1960 because of colonialism. And when these young people come here, the culture here is way advanced, and we have to drag them back. You are living in an era that is maybe not the same.
Okay.
So how do you do that? How do you maintain the cultural values?
We're going to take another question, just to take a couple, but I think that question is best for Patrick for now, and maybe.
Thank you.
Before we take the second question, I just want to acknowledge our third panelist, Ms. Sylvie Bello. She's president of Cameroonian American Council and does tremendous work on Pan-African advocacy here in the United States, and she does quite a bit of work on engaging with African diaspora as a constituency. So on the public outreach, Sylvie's done a lot of good work on that. Okay, second question. I know you've had your hand up in the back with the hat.
Hello, my name is Shadiah Gray. I'm a junior finance major currently attending Howard University, and as a Yali fellow who's very interested, member of the diaspora, who's very interested in traveling to Africa. Is there any support systems for students who don't necessarily have the resources or the funds to do so, but really want to?
Okay, that's great. Let's take.
I've already been accepted as a Yali fellow.
Have you really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Congratulations. All right, let's take those two questions.
Thanks for your question. On culture, it's a very complex issue, and you talked about sort of how, you're asking about how Yali sort of sustains culture. I think what I can say is we have to, first of all, put things in context. Culture is a very fluid notion, and we bring, young African fellows from all over the continent who come with their own perceptions, traditions, and outlooks on life. And I think one of the really positive outcomes of the 6 weeks that they spend in the States, and then is that for the first time for many of the fellows, they get to meet other Africans from other countries, from other African countries, from other parts of the same countries, and you begin to have these conversations take place among them. And I think out of those conversations, and we see this sort of the feedback we get, you sometimes have points of friction. You have points where you have instances where fellows sort of actually see, in spite of the thousands of miles or the linguistic barriers that might or might not separate them, that they really have, for the most part, very, very similar views on what they see as progress, what they see as change, what they see as values. And it's not our purpose to come and instill culture or perpetuate any specific notions of what is right or what's wrong. It's about creating spaces where these conversations can be had. And so that's what we do. As to how those things will transpire once they're back home, we hope that these conversations, these interactions will form the beginning of, greater discussions, dialogue, and hopefully will contribute in some ways to positive changes in those societies. That's what I can say. Regarding the second question about resources and just let's have a chat afterwards. I think we're coming up with some attempts to sort of encourage not just Africans coming to the States, but also Americans going to Africa and interacting with fellows once they're back home and seeing how they operate in the environment. And we do have some initiatives which are afoot. And I can talk to you more specificity afterwards. So just grab me and talk to you.
I'm Sylvie Bello. Apologies, I just came back from Virginia, Longwood, where the vice presidential debate will be taking place at Longwood University. We're trying to insert African immigrants into the vice presidential debate. To your question, one of the things, agenda issues that the Cameroon American Council is actually working on is actually on IREX. The Cameroon American Council is actually very disappointed with the way IREX puts out cultural competency. So one of the issues that we have with IREX and other contractors or subcontractors with YALI is the fact that they actually do not do an extensive job in connecting the YALI fellows that come to the United States with Africans in the United States. One example, met a young man from Ghana. He is from Ewe tribe. And he's a YALI fellow, and I did ask him, I said, oh, while you were here, did you get a chance to connect with the other Ewe people? Because they have a very strong, anyone from Ghana in here? Ghana, okay. So you know about the Ewe. So there's a strong Ewe community that is actually led by some of my colleagues and friends. And he had no idea that there were even Ghanaian associations, let alone a group from his particular tribe. So I did email him, the leaders of the Ewe Association of North America. You're right. Cultural competency is very critical when you're talking about governance or when you're talking about entrepreneurship. IREX does a very poor job in connecting those dots, which is why tomorrow we're going to be meeting with the State Department to discuss YALI and IREX and how they can do a better job in connecting the Africans who are right here, the people who are actually contributing twice into the IREX funding. One, when we send money back home, right? And two, when we pay our taxes right here. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. That's great. We're going to take two more questions, another round. We've got our friend here. Yes?
Thank you so much. My name is what I have is not necessarily a question, but a comment. Reflecting on what Mr. Okoko said, you say the private sector is not absorbing the youth to the required degree or standard. And the problem that was identified is the fact that sometimes it's because they are not attractive. For me, that is a manifestation of the problem. The fact that they are not being absorbed is not a problem, but a manifestation of the problem. The question we should be asking ourselves is, why are they not being absorbed? Why are they not attractive? And that goes to the way our training curriculum in most African countries are shaped. Just from the school level or from the university or college level, you'll be able to tell. But when I go out into what is popularly known as the field, our problems. We need to actually reshape the training curriculum for most of our universities and colleges. And we need to change the mindset for the youth out there. Because what most of them know is, I'm going to school so that tomorrow I'll get employed. But we should change that and tell them, let's teach them, or impart in them the understanding that it's not about being employed, it's also about being an employer. I can leave school today, tomorrow maybe start my own business. In 2-3 years' time it will grow and I'll be able to employ other people. And by so doing, we will also be building our own youth. We will be building our own leaders in Africa. We will be able to employ other people. And the issue of youth migrating from Africa going somewhere else is something that can be mitigated. That is the situation today because they are only able to see opportunities outside. But if we change that situation, I'm sure we won't talk about youth not being attractive. We are not going to talk about youth leaving Africa to go and seek employment or opportunities outside Africa.
Thank you. Those are very good points. Another question. I would love to keep that gender balance going. I do run a women's leadership network. I've got a sister over there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My
have one comment and one question for Mr. Patrick. First of all, I would like to know, as we say, we have the next generation, we have the future of Africa, and we have part of this YALI program. How the program officer can be assured that after this program, we know we have enrollment and we will stay connected. But tomorrow we are going to be in a position to, how can I say, in a leading position in our country, maybe in 10 years. So how can you, as a member of program officer of IREX, how can you stay connected with us to ensure that what we have learned here about we are still to keep this patient, and we are going to be able to be a better leader tomorrow, in the future, maybe in 10 years. And my second comment is actually we talk about when we heard about Africa, there is a main issue about democracy and good governance. So we know that there is 4 tracks actually in the YALI program. Why not have a track about politics? And we can, how can I say, we like this track, you can connect it. All African young are some interest on politics, are some political interest, and those they have maybe in local party in their country, to give them some skills of what can be a good political man. And in order that maybe in 10 years also, if they want to be leaders in politics, they have these skills to be like a good political, as we talk about democracy, transparency, and good governance. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to remind everyone, to be fair, because this is not limited to YALI or IREX, I'm going to first answer your question directly. Number one, leadership in all of our cultures, communities, starts at home. And it starts with the ability of us allowing each other to discover our leadership skills. And secondly, there are also many, many other Africa-based, Africa-led leadership institutions and programs.
That's right.
So there are many, many Africa-based programs that are investing in African leaders. We have the Tony Elumelu Foundation doing this entrepreneurship. We have the Mo Ibrahim Foundation based in the UK focusing on African leaders. We have the Tutu Fellowship Program. We have the Africa Leadership Network. We have colleges and universities on the continent, Pan-African universities. So we have to think of this more broadly. And secondly, as a member of the diaspora, I'll argue, oddly enough, that these leadership programs cannot be established abroad and managed abroad, especially by a non-African diaspora organization. I believe that there's partnerships to be made, but it has to start in the community and in the continent with its diasporas and its partnerships. So this isn't even a slight on YALI per se, because YALI is quite amazing. But the expectation that YALI should do more is my problem. The fact is 500 Africans, leaders who are changing the world back home, are here for 6 to 8 weeks. And Howard University works its butt off for those 8 weeks and then the additional 6. The fellows go through a gruesome schedule. They are put in front of CEOs and presidents and vice presidents, and groups like Sylvie's, groups like mine, we are knocking on doors for that meeting. And it's happening. So Sylvie's feedback is right, that there is some tuning to do. But what's happening right now is this is information overload for leaders that have more work to do back home. I think the conversation needs to be about how do we in the diaspora support and improve African leadership initiatives that are in fact African by nature or equally invested in Africa's future. Can I just say that? Is that okay what I'm saying? Because we need to have this honest conversation with ourselves as members of the diaspora of what we're actually looking to for solutions. I'm not going to ask IREX for any more edits. I'm not until we show up, right? Sylvie shows up, other organizations show up, but the way you show up is with programmatic solutions. And I think you're giving them. I think you're giving them. So let's reassess let's do the mathing. Let's look at the bigger picture. Where are we on African leadership investments? African. And Yali's one. U.S. government can't do it. It was just President Obama's vision. There's no assurance that Yali will be here in 2, 3, 4 years. So why do we have to hinge all of our effort on that? Let's look at the big picture. And the big picture is there are 8 to 10 meaningful, impactful African organizations that are large, and there are many more that are small. And for us in the diaspora, we have to partner with the institutions that are here. You can call Patrick tomorrow, don't do it today. Call him and ask for a meeting, conduct that meeting like you would any other meeting, but then you also need to figure out how you support Africa-based initiatives. This is a big, I feel very strongly about this because Africans and people in the diaspora who care about the continent, we're putting too much on the things that are already underway. We aren't thinking of how to leverage and strengthen the entry points to what's on the continent. Okay? Answer the question for sure. I needed to say that for perspective.
Okay. So thank you very much for that question. I hear you, sister. But you know what? IRIS gets her tax dollars. Okay? So we are going to go on to them again. So to your point, IRIS, which is a subcontractor for the U.S. government, so in addition to the fact that at the Cameroon American Council, we do not feel that IRIS actually is fully engaging culturally sensitive organizations and leaders. The second part is we do not feel, in terms of what happens with the alumni, that IRIS and all the other tax getting agencies that that fund IRIS are doing a great job when it comes to the Central African region. So for instance, the second ask that we made was that what happens to the Congolese? Anyone from Congo? Any of the Congos? Hoo-hoo! Any of the Congos? Central Africa, both, good. Okay, the two Congos, Cameroon, Chad, the fabulous, countries that make up Central African region. They actually do not have support. The YALI program, and for which includes Cameroon, and for a leader of the Central African region, when I think about the fact that my tax dollars is going to fund YALI, and the folks from Congo, from Chad, from Cameroon don't have that support because why? YALI does not actually have a Central African region. So in order for the alumni to get the kind of follow-up that they need, they either have to go to East Africa, Southern Africa, or West Africa. So how are they, in that network talking about or engaging or even knowing the Central African region? As you know, the Central African region is unstable. And on September 29th, I'm just going to put a plug out there, the Congressional Cameroon Caucus, which is led by both Republicans and Democrats, will be putting on a big expo in the U.S. Congress, and we're inviting all our Central Africans, all our Africans to come out and support. So the second point is to get YALI to get whoever is funding them. That's our tax dollars, right? To include a Central African region. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about that with the State Department. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I want to let Jackie and Patrick share their thoughts, and then we'll conclude with the questions. It's going to be very hard to get everyone's questions, but I'd like to hear a bit from Jackie on what we're discussing as a fellow observing this question in this context.
I think you've answered part of what I was going to say when there was the cultural sensitivity question that came up. I think what the U.S. government has tried to do here is provide a platform, and as a fellow, what I felt that the biggest takeaway of this program was that they've brought together young fellows from the continent to the US to come and network within each other in a safe space, to think of ideas in which, or to think of activities and ideas in which they can make the continent better. So it was, to me at least, and this is my 12th week now, it has barely been about listening to the cultural or taking in US cultural norms. It's more about how can we together, how can we, and the lecturers that we've had have come and facilitated sessions in which they share a little bit about themselves, and then you'll find the Senegalese, you'll find the South Africans, you'll find, the Nigerians, usually the countries that are more, how do you say, voice first, outwards, to contributing about things that they've been doing in their own countries. And so it was always about, here's what we're doing, and then what are you guys doing, and then how can you collaborate within yourselves to be able to come with a solution to whatever country-specific problem that you're having. So I think you can rest assured that it's not us, going back to the continent and then trying to initiate discussions on which gender should be using the bathroom, or things that are happening here at that level. We're not there yet. We're still trying to ensure that there are bathrooms, public bathrooms for people to use. We pretty much know what our discussions are and where our cultural limits will allow us to go. And then in relation to the last discussion that was just going on,
The spaces for political interest, or how to stay in touch.
how to stay in touch. I think this is a very new project, and perhaps, Patrick will be able to elaborate a little bit more on it. But the way I see is, until this year, there was no regional leadership center for Lusophone countries or Portuguese-speaking countries. And so this year, the South African Regional Leadership Center has opened a satellite office, will open a satellite office in Mozambique. And so that will cover Mozambique and Angola. And for us, that's a big win. That means that people will go through training in our countries with mostly faculty that are from the region and Portuguese-speaking countries. They'll go through their training there, within the country. They don't have to come all the way to the US. So I think it's an organic process that will happen slowly if the program goes on to the next administration, which hopefully it will, because I think it's good for both, all sides involved. But it's something that comes with time. I work for government, and sometimes you pitch an idea, and it has to start small, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's always good to have activists and people who are fighting for the causes. And I don't think Central Africa is the only region that wants more of these regional leadership centers. There've been other requests, and even about language here in the U.S. There've been requests that maybe you do it in French and Portuguese and other languages, so that everybody is on board with the material that's being covered. But that's a complex operation, and I hope, and from what I've seen, they've been expanding. Last year there was 500 fellows. This year there's 1,000 fellows. So next year hopefully there'll be 1,000 or 2,000 fellows coming, and they're upping the stake. But
up to 1,000. Now I think these conversations, and I definitely appreciate the viewpoints you have and how strongly you feel about engaging the diaspora, and I think that speaks to the passions and our commitment to the continent of all, and our desperate desire to see change. And this is one venue, one means through which that could potentially be impacted. But I think we also have to be realistic in terms of the resources we have and the capacity we have in order to effect some of that change. And I think that's through, if we're talking sustainability, through partnerships, and by making sure that folks on the continent and in the diaspora are also finding ways to contribute, whether directly or indirectly. And I think before you came in, I made a point about the fact that we are looking into ways to engage the diaspora. The programs, we're in we just finished our third year, we're going to fourth year. And we're always looking, we take feedback, we look critically at ourselves after each group of fellows come through, and we examine ways to sort of, enhance the program so that the fellows have as wonderful an opportunity to engage and to learn as possible within a very constricted period of time. So, like I said, my door's open to you if you have, other additional feedback you wish to share. But this is a conversation, and our outlook is we can always look to improve and to expand the program. But we do work within the prescriptions of our funders, and so that's a reality. But definitely, I definitely appreciate your forthright perspectives.
Right first.
That's great. Okay, time for one more round of questions. We have a little bit more. Gentleman with the blue.
Sylvia, I've been following you. Patrick, my name is Charles Sharp. I'm with the Black Emergency Managers Association. So thank you for that information on Central Africa. We're about to get in partnership with that. And looking at disaster, emergency management, and crisis management. And development to work with you guys. So it's a matter of just those within the diaspora. And our association is international, but mainly within the African descent communities. So we look at community engagement. So we will be looking at Central Africa. I was supposed to be in DRC in August. Y'all my shots, but there you go. And we will be contacting you, and we already have. It's just a matter now of working out the logistics.
Questions for the panelists on youth leadership? Gentleman with the beard.
Okay, thank you for the statements that you made somehow as well as Sylvie. Now, first of all, I heard a couple of things about cultural sensitivity, also about looking at the broader picture. And most of the time, Africa is lumped in one discussion, right? So the question that comes to mind for me is, with all these different cultures, different religions, different regions, different countries, what brings us together, right? Just like when we look at the European Union, when we look at Asian nations, there are so many different needs. But where we bridge the gap is value creation and value exchange, right? So maybe some of the programs that we look to as leaders on the continent, here in the diaspora, should focus a lot on monetization of solutions, right? It's hard for me to dictate or to really manage every political discussion on the continent as a leader. But what I can do is I can connect with people that are problems. We provide monetized solutions. We create sustainability, we create employment, we create engagement, and we also come to the discussion with partner countries like the United States, or recently I think Japan was offering or willing to invest a certain amount in Africa. We come to the table with value. We come to the table with self-worth, with something we can negotiate with, and we can also negotiate the terms of the engagement. If we don't like them, we can offer that value on a lot of different spaces. So I like the work that you guys are doing. I like the confidence you have the work that you guys are doing. Thanks a lot.
We're African. So the question is about values and how do we incorporate values into it. Thank you.
Value exchange and
Value exchange. That's a great one. And then I'm still on that gender balance, so we're just going to alternate.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma. I'm Kuntal Sixbedi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Child Risk Survival International. It's an international nonprofit based out of Baltimore, and currently we're in Tanzania and Uganda, slowly working to South Africa and Nigeria. This is a great panel, and one of the areas we focus on is especially the girl child in those very underserved communities. With YALI and so many other programs that are out there that are doing great work in terms of empowering our young leaders, how can an organization like CSI that's based here in the US engage with you to reach that girl who doesn't even know about YALI or any other program to help her achieve her dreams? Because we're doing as much as we can, but you're providing a whole lot more that maybe can fill in those gaps. So how can we engage with you to make sure that we're reaching those girls that we are serving in underserved communities?
Okay, thank you. Let's take those two if we can. Maybe Jackie, if you had experience.
I think one of the, let me just, I think one of the things which, if you talk about values, the whole, and I'm going to talk specifically to the YALI and then I'll speak beyond that, is of course it's founded on the whole notion of leadership as from Nelson Mandela's perspective, Ubuntu, and the essence of servant leadership. And I think that's something you can't really just define generically, but it's something which is very specific to unique spaces and cultures and traditions. But the essence is the idea, one of the core components of the program is to encourage the young people to sort of not look at leadership as an entitlement, but as in fact a responsibility and something which is to be handled from that perspective. And I think we've seen through the program some really interesting conversations about what that means for these young Africans in their communities, what they perceive as leadership, and how their role in that, and how they can perhaps try and impact their communities when they're back home. In terms, I like the idea, the point made about Africa being lumped, the whole notion of African values. What does that mean? I mean, it's a ridiculous notion in some regards. There are commonalities, but within countries, you find very unique outlooks on how people perceive values, things which matter, and that's why there's a lot of work for us to do in various spaces across the continent. That's why you are seeing people in the diaspora, people back home, these young leaders engaging in initiatives which try and push forward what we see as progressive values in terms of creating spaces for the girl child, in terms of education and what notions of education entail. One of the questions, one of the contributions earlier was about why the graduates who come out of the universities are not equipped to take jobs in the private sector. Because you have to look at the source of the kind of education they're getting and how that impacts society. So all these things are interlinked, but and I think in terms of the discussion, I think it's something, the key thing is to open spaces for dialogue with people to talk. It's very easy to sort of build barriers and bridges and hold perspectives, but once you have people interact, it's really fascinating the outcomes you have. And I think from the YALI perspective, that's what we hope to achieve, that we begin the conversations, we begin the interactions, we begin to foster communication from these fellows who otherwise would never have had opportunities to engage or to interact.
I'm sorry, by value exchange, I meant economic value, solutions to problems, right?
Absolutely.
So me getting the training that I need, and when I say me, I mean any athlete, women, men, young, older, everyone should be engaged. Getting the training to have a skill, to learn a certain technology, to even the discussions, to find solutions to problems, and then offer them at a value in the market, right? That neutralizes politics, not neutralizes, eliminates it, but neutralizes it, provides an equalized space for different genders, for old, young, for different countries, different tribes. Anyone, if someone had the cure for AIDS, you wouldn't care what their religion or their ethnicity or national affiliation was. Of course, that would be an opportunity that anyone would work with. So that's what I was referring to.
You know what my takeaway from all of this is really about preserving the spaces to offer ideas and be innovative, and creating them and then preserving them. Because even where markets can exist comfortably in Africa, it's still a high barrier. And then there are parts of the continent where markets just are not accessible or even active, right? Because we've still got other challenges on the continent. So whether it's the private sector, public sector, whatever area the value exists in, it's about creating and preserving the spaces, right, for leadership to be instilled and to grow. And I just want to conclude our conversation by really sharing what I have always said to our people, my people, all of us, is to create the spaces you wish existed. And create the spaces is being done by people who aren't African. And as Africans, as members of the diaspora, as an example of CFA's own work, it's creating these spaces. The Black Emergency Managers Association, I love that. Dawn, I mean, these are examples of how you insert yourself, right, and your ideas. The challenge is how you implement them and make them sustainable. And so there's always room for improvement. There's so much work to be done. But for those that are doing the work, it's about sizing it up and scaling, I don't want to say scaling it up, but making it such that it's just, that it's equitable, and that it's accessible. Okay? So
one thing,
yes.
one resource for the lady regarding women and girls. So we should definitely go after the federal government, but we should also think locally. Since you're out of Baltimore, the Baltimore mayor has a women's council. So if you try to reach out to them about some of the resources that they may have in connecting, maybe some Tanzanian, you did say Tanzania and Uganda youth right here, as well as the folks back home. The First Lady has a Let Girls Learn. And she actually took it out to the continent, to a couple of countries. I don't know if it extends to the southern African countries, but I'm sure. And then, of course, Congress just opened up the Congressional Caucus on African American Women, which, as you know, Black women in America, we are, you know, African American, and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke out of New York runs it. And to the point about exchanges, so September is African Immigrant Heritage Month, which is celebrated right here in Washington, D.C., and across the country, including the U.S. Congress. And one of the things that they recognize is the fact that as African immigrants, we are the most educated Americans. So when President Obama talks about he wants America to outperform and out-innovate the rest of the world, that's not gonna happen without your most educated Americans, including right here at Howard University. But you know what happens? The president, his Africa team, 10 out of 12 are non-African. Do you think he would ever do that with his Jewish liaison team? Do you think he would ever do that with the Asian liaison team? Now, we can have all of this education right here at Howard University. Go out to Brookings to get a job. Do you know what they're going to tell you? They'll get somebody who spent 1 week, you know, on a safari somewhere in Kenya. So, what we're going to need is not just to have safe spaces. We've had tons of safe spaces. We need action. We're going to need you, right, to talk to folks like IREX, folks who get our direct funding. Because with Brookings, yes, Brookings gets our dollars, but you know, it's very indirect, right? So we're gonna talk to people like IREX, right? To look into their payroll. How many Africans are you hiring? How many Africans are you subcontracting to? That's a direct question they can answer. Thank you.